Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Vikingology, the art and science of the Viking Age. Today, I'm really excited to have Octavia Randolph, bestselling author, focused on the Viking Age. She's joining us from the island of Gotland, off the coast of Sweden. Welcome, Octavia.
Thank you so much, Terry and CJ. It's a delight to be here with you today.
Great to meet you.
Thank you.
So to kick things off, the question I usually like to start with when it comes to people who are more on the art side of things, such as authors, artists, etc. Why the Vikings? How did we get into that period of time? What led you down that path as opposed to, say, the ancient Celts or the Romans?
I want to say something at the onset which will help frame the way I look at that word. I write a series of historical fiction books. It's an 11-book series right now, set in the late 9th century. The first book is set in the year 871, the year when an extraordinarily abled and capable young man by the name of Alfred became the King of Wessex. And the series is a series of it's a multi-generational family saga. It takes place both in England, Denmark, and here on the island of Gotland. It is over 2 million words at this point. In that text, I use the word Viking exactly once. And I oftentimes say this to people because modern people are not aware how unusual that term actually is and was. It very, very rarely appears in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and in any Old Norse annals. It's a very unusual word, and when I use it in my one instance, it is a young Viking warrior who, after his first kill, says to himself in a quiet moment, "This is what it is to go a Viking." So again, not as a people group, not an identifier as a people group, but an identifier as an activity. So I'm oftentimes gently correcting people and guiding them towards the term Dane or Norse or Svere, if they were Swedish. Of course, we all are familiar, students of the period, of the way the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle refers to the invaders, which is the Great Army, the Danes, or our favorite, the heathen horde. So again, the word Vikings almost never used. So I'm really writing in the Circle of Círdan Saga about the formation of the English people. And that's an expansive topic, but I want to keep the focus really on the fact that that term, although it's a useful shorthand, and I certainly do use the term Viking in my marketing materials because it conveys so much, it's so concise. People immediately can place the era and the general activity. But actually in my books, I use it one time. So that gives you kind of an overview of what I write about and how I approach the era.
I love that. So it's funny because with my books, I did the exact same thing. It's mentioned once very, very early in my series to go a Viking, right? So, and they don't refer to themselves. And in the historical note, I mentioned, because I focus more on the west coast of France, so I use Frankish annals, and like in the Annales d'Angoulême, for example, they refer to them as Vestfaldingi, men from Vestfold.
Right.
And so there's a more regional self-identification going on that we can see.
Much more nuanced, right?
Yeah, I appreciate that precision because it's true. And I think, Terry, from the historian side, the nomenclature of the word Viking is a bit of a prickly perch as well.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it, the lore that we've come to sort of build around that word. Sorry, I always talk with my hands. I don't know why. Is that it's, it's pretty recent, right? It's like probably 19th century forward, but, we do know that it does appear in some sources in the past. Yeah. And so when you think about the etymology of words,
means, creek. It means, a creek and a bay.
Yeah,
so
right.
you
right.
know, I mean,
Geography.
the word Vic
Yeah.
is a real word.
Right.
But, you know.
Yeah, but also as the profession, as people, even who is it? I think even Adam of Bremen, like, you know, the Germans, what do they call them? An Ashmen, but that they call themselves Viking. I mean, so it appears, and we understand roughly what they mean by that now. And as you say, right, it's a job description. It's not an ethnicity. It doesn't refer to a group of people per se.
I like that, a job description.
Yeah, right. Well, yeah, exactly. But I think it's always interesting, you know, with the etymology of words historically, is that we come to think of it in a certain way, but then, you know, it's much more important to understand, like, well, did they know of that word back then? And if so, what did they mean by it? And so this is, I think, the consensus, at least in the historian community, is that we have an understanding that what they meant by it was basically, you know, this job, this thing that people did, which, you know, a lot of people will say is probably akin loosely to
and much of the time a very part-time job.
Yes,
because most of these men were farmers and fishermen, and it was a part-time summer job activity for most of them.
Right. So where do you come from originally?
I am American of English descent, and therefore I have a very strong connection to English history. My fascination with the Anglo-Saxon age really came from the glorious artifacts left behind, the contents of rooms 39 through 42 at the British Museum, the Sutton Hoo treasure, I see you smiling, the Sutton Hoo treasure, the tableau treasure, Ethelwulf's ring, you know, all of those, you know, wonderful artifacts that we have, which are so vivid and so inspiring. And of course, on the north side, you have equally glorious things as well. So it was really the physical attraction as well as the very exciting story about, you know, the collapse of the heptarchy, and, you know, this one young man who really kind of rose to the challenge. Alfred does figure in my novels. He's a secondary and tertiary character, and my characters interact around him. But it's such a pivotal time in history. It's such an exciting time that it really called to me to kind of express it, and that was the fascination. And the fascination, you know, continues. And again, as we continue to find more amazing objects, you know, and which deepen our knowledge year by year, there's endless resources for us for our fascination.
Yeah, I mean, CJ and I have said that, I think, several times, right, on this podcast, as far as, you know, me being a historian is kind of text-based, although I have a background in the arts, and so I'm very keenly aware of sort of the nature of, you know, objects, right, as the things that are quote unquote documents as well. It doesn't have to be things that are written, but that, you know, we have written sources that people can pore over again and again and again, and every person that's new to it, of course, brings new eyes to it. But it's probably, there's, you know, only so much where you can go with that. But as new archaeology comes into play and newer things, you know, that we've never seen before get dug up, or more modern scientific testing being done to, you know, maybe on skeletal remains and things like that, that can all of a sudden really, you know, that's kind of where the action is at right now.
Indeed.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, you know, in contrast to the Viking Age Scandinavians, you know, the England at the time, or what we refer today to as England, the very early on, I think we had the Venerable Bede who mentioned the gens Anglorum, the English peoples. There was a certain identity present there that, you know, going back to the whole discussion on Viking Age Scandinavians, that doesn't appear to be consistent in Scandinavia. I just had that thought, so I just want to dangle that out there. So with your books, so where did you start on the subject, and then where has it taken you? Because I know as a writer myself, I started with one subject, and then it just kind of opened a couple of doors for me down the road where I just kind of kept, but the research and experience of it took me in a direction I wouldn't have imagined at the beginning of the project, right? And so you mentioned you started with the formation of England, Alfred, and then here you are chatting with us.
Very true. Yeah.
Chatting with us in Gotland.
That's right. and points east. Right?
Yeah.
So the the story of the Circle of Caradhran saga is really a story between a deep friendship between two young women. The titular character Caradhran is half Welsh and half Saxon. She's only 15 years old in the first book. Now in the 11th book, she's 40. So it's her and her dear friend Alfwyn, who is a Saxon noblewoman, and Alfwyn is 17 when they meet. And the male characters that they interact with, many of whom are Dane, because this, the body of the first few books really does take place in Wessex and in Lindesay. And so it is definitely the point of view of the women living through this extraordinarily tumultuous time. The theme, unspoken theme throughout the entire book, is examination of the question, who is my enemy? And how these young women are interacting with, men who should have been their enemy, the Danes, and so on and so forth. So it began there, and it began, fairly locally. However, in 1999, when I embarked on an extensive research trip through the Nordic lands, my second stop was Gotland. And the reason that Gotland was so important is it contains unique treasures which do not exist anywhere else, and that is the standing painted stones, from which we have learned more about Old Norse life than we have from any other source, because of the way in which they have been decorated. We've learned more about ships and rigging and steering oars and hairstyles and fashions, and so much about saga stories. And there's so many things we cannot interpret from that era. But as it turns out, because Gotland was first peopled 8,000 years ago, it's extremely rich in Bronze Age finds as well. And some of the standing stones are very early and quite magnificent. And then they move right through to, past the point of Christianization, when these carved, beautifully decorated stones then appear with crosses on them, written runic inscriptions, but crosses. So I came to see those, and it is quite an amazing fact, and really kind of hard to get your head around, that in this small island, which is about 100 miles long and 35 miles wide, in the middle of the Baltic, over 700 silver hoards have been found. Mm-hmm. Over 700. There have been tons of silver that have been found here. And when I had arrived in September of 1999, the largest Viking Age hoard ever found had just been unearthed in July. And that is known as the Spillings Hoard. And it's called the Spillings Hoard because that is the name of the farm that it was found on the north east coast of Gotland, above a Vik, above a bay. It's called Bogavik. And it consisted of 67 kilos of silver, 148 pounds of silver, and also a remarkably beautiful amount of very well worked Slavic bronze. It was 20 kilos, 44 pounds of beautiful bronze work, which had been deposited under a farmhouse. And these in three different caches, very close to each other, just a few meters away from each other. They were found by the farmer who owns the farm, and he immediately called the county. Again, this was one of 700 hoards that's been found, and hoards are being found all the time. Hoards have been kicked out of the earth by bunny rabbits here. There's people felling trees. Silver has spilled out of the roots. It's just astonishing rich. And why is this? Gotland was a uniquely peaceful place during the Viking Age. It had no king. It had no king. It had no warlord. Gotland was peopled by prosperous, clever, hardworking farmer traders. Its location, more or less in the middle of the Baltic, meant that it was an ideal destination for Silk Road trade, crossing the Baltic and heading, further west to the trading posts of Haithabu and Birka and Ribe. And so ships were landing here, they were taking on fresh supplies, and they were trading. The results of all of this meant that there was an amazing amount of silver coinage from the East. In the Spillings hoard alone, there were 14,300 coins. There's been over 200,000 coins found here on Gotland. And by the way, more late Anglo-Saxon coins have been found here on Gotland that have ever been found in Britain. Think about that.
When did all that start? Is like 19th century archaeology, or?
Oh no, it's been dug up much earlier than that. And who know? I mean, we have records, like church records, where the parson was out, digging a grave, and he came across this hoard, and then melted it down for a paten and a chalice. I mean, it has constantly been found over hundreds and hundreds of years. But the 14,300 coins that were found in the Spillings hoard, the largest silver hoard ever found on Earth, were almost all Arabian dirhams. And this was money that was trade. This was trading money, and that was being poured into here. It is perhaps significant that the farmstead in which the Spillings hoard was found appears to have been the home and workshop of a smith. Of course, smiths were always prosperous members of any community, and magical members of any community too, because they could control fire and iron and make useful implements and weaponry. So here was a very rich family who had deposited their savings. And it's just one of so many, 700, again, hoards that have been unearthed. Much treasure coming from the East as a result of the Silk Roads. So you see my fascination. Yeah. Just, not to mention that the island itself is very beautiful and extremely varied. So there's so much here, and a set of my characters end up living after volume 3, book 3. They end up living here on Gotland. So there's every single book has a portion of the activity which takes place here on Gotland as well. So
yeah, it's always been a fascinating, every time it comes up in a book, Gotland, like the Grina Colony, for example, which is in Latvia, Estonia. I always forget which one it is. I think it's Estonia. Well, Estonia, and somebody can correct me. There you go. But distinctly at the beginning, so they have different ages of that settlement, so the different time periods, and the very early ones are distinctly Gotlanders, right? So they were the first really to start stepping eastward to begin that trade. Right. So it's really, we're talking about a focal point for the beginning of the Viking Age, and then also a very important site throughout the entire Viking Age, and even through the High Medieval period as well. I do have pictures that you sent us if you want to go over those.
Let's look at some of those, because I know our listeners and viewers will be interested in seeing some of the attraction here. Just to sort of begin at the beginning, again, people have lived on Gotland for 8,000 years. Gotland is and always has been slowly rising out of the Baltic. 8,000 years ago, there was huge expanses of water covering the surface of much of Gotland. As the ice age melted and receded, and the aquifers were replenished, Gotland continues to rise out of the water. In fact, it gets larger every year. It's very, very interesting that the creation story of Gotland, and the first man on Gotland, a fellow whose name is Gelvar, whose grave you can visit, and I have many times. He lives he's buried in a boat shape, supposedly buried in one of the beautiful ship-setting graves on the East Coast. But the story of Gelvar, which is in the Gas Saga, the foundational story of the Goots, the Gotlanders, is a fascinating one, and really refers to the topography and it coming out of the water. Gotland used to vanish every night under the waters, and Shelver arrived and, like Prometheus, brought fire. And that stopped it from sinking under the waves. And he brought a wife with him, or found a woman, perhaps Adam and Eve like. They had 3 sons, and he divided Gotland into 3s for these sons, administrative units which still exist, with the very center, quite precisely located, the town of Ruma is where the Althing was. And it became later on in the 14th century the site of a huge Cistercian monastery. So there's always been a power center right in the very center. So you have a very, very long history here, and more than 400 cairns, burial mounds from the Bronze Age, some of which are just enormous. And in the center of these, and many of which have not been excavated yet, but those that have been excavated typically will have this little burial chamber for cremated remains in its heart. There's a couple of the huge burial mounds which have been literally taken apart so you can enter them and see the inner structure of them, because there's not just piles of stone one upon the other. There was actually internal walls and sort of passages, and then a small stone coffin like this would be used for the remains. So this would have been beautifully painted, as you can see. They were painted with lamp black, with charcoal and fixative gum fixatives, and you'll also see some red, I think, in my pictures. I'm not sure, but which was, of course, iron oxide that was used. So the painted stones here in Gotland are usually red and black, sometimes traces of mineral yellow as well. This picture is from our fabulous little museum here in Visby, the Gotland's Museum, the Fornsalen, and there's just the picture stone hall is jaw-dropping. So this chieftain was likely cremated right on the site, and oftentimes at these huge burial mounds, you can see that cremation area is still blackened from fire. And he would have been burnt with grave goods. And because, of course, of the cremation process, very little survives, but small pieces of metal and things often have survived. Oftentimes, sons or wives, other family members could have joined him in smaller mounds around. Infrequently, the mound was opened at some edge and another one of these chambers placed. But I did want you to see how beautiful this is, and how when you're walking in the woods, you will very oftentimes come upon a chamber. It won't be as beautifully decorated as this is. It will be worn away, but you'll come upon a small oblong in the woods, and you'll know, okay, this was a site of cremation burial. So that is a really lovely artifact from the Bronze Age. So we can.
When is the date on this one?
So this would be the Bronze Age here was like 1800 BCE to 500 BCE. Everything, of course, has shifted in the Nordic world. So things happen more slowly, and we got into the time shifts were a little bit behind that of continental Europe. So this would be, sometime in the 1800 to 1800. Before a common era, something like that. Could be earlier for sure.
Okay, yeah, this is good because I know, from the American perspective too, and I've done work with Nordic peoples, Nordic scholars, where contextualizing it for our audience in that, even with the Vikings, for us, the quote unquote Middle Ages or medieval period is, a period in which the Vikings are kind of smack in the middle. Whereas if you're a European, the Vikings come and then the medieval period starts after them. So it's like, try to at least be a little clear for our audience. Yeah.
Right.
Well, in France, it's the Moyen Âge is from the end of the Romans all the way to the Renaissance. So they kind of do that broad sweep as well. And the Vikings are a very teeny tiny little bit in there.
Which I like the Moyen Âge. I think that's a lovely way to look at it. I really do. It's much more expansive.
Yeah. I do want to jump in real quick at something that you mentioned, just for our listeners' benefit. There's a study that came out in, I want to say 2019, I believe, that that looked at, so one of the enduring mysteries that archaeologists were trying to solve, and I think they had to work with geologists on this one too, was why the rising ocean levels in modern times hasn't been affecting, you know, the lowlands and the Netherlands, and then in Denmark as well. Like, they haven't been losing
and northern
land.
Scandinavia, right?
Yeah, and it's because they figured out that it's because during the last ice age there was so much ice on the continent that the weight of it pushed all the ground down.
That's
and
true.
then for the last 10,000 years it's been rising.
It's
but not only
feeding
has
the
it,
aquifers, yes, and
right,
pushing it back up again. And
yeah,
lucky for us, you know,
right.
here.
And so that's why, like, for example, Hedeby is inland 50 kilometers where it used to be on the coast, because the land is actually rising, and it's keeping a pace with the rising of the oceans from global warming. Can we call it global warming still? Climate change.
Let's please be honest. Yes, Heisabu, Hedeby, Beka, same thing happened there. And the same thing happened to our larger trading post, which was Paviken. Paviken is on the west coast. It's just south of Visby. And it was a very prosperous lagoon in which was well hidden, but it had wonderful shipwrights there. We know there was a tremendous amount of ship building and ship repairing going on, which you can imagine if you'd weathered a difficult crossing across the Baltic and you'd been dismasted, or your mast lock had broken, or the steering oar had broken, whatever, to know that you could come to Paviken and have really skilled shipwrights repair your ship. But that area now, Paviken, which was the foremost trading post on the island, is now a bird sanctuary with very little water in it. I mean, there's just a small amount of water. It's fascinating because they have really unearthed, the foundations of some of the buildings, but it very dramatically shows how much Gotland has risen out of the Baltic in the last 1,200 years.
Yeah, and how fascinating that we've just only figured this out in the last couple of years, but then embedded in their foundational narrative, right, in Gotland, with their stories, they had an awareness of it, which is incredible, right?
Yes, it is phenomenal. I mean, the story of Chelver, the first man, they completely nailed it. That he stopped this, it's sinking beneath the water. So, it's one of the really endearing things about the Gas Saga, as brief as it is, but it is a wonderful foundation story.
So since we're on geography, I want to point interjection here, just a point of correction for our audience. So Grobina is in Latvia.
There we go. I always get it backwards. I always go for Estonia for some reason.
Well, remember that those were very fluid geographical areas during the Viking Age as well. So these were sort of tribal people. I mean, the Prus, the Polony, the Pomerani, all of these people, and the Estonians, there was a lot of fluidity, and these modern borders certainly have changed quite a bit in the 20th century as well.
Yeah, of course, especially in the post-war years. But
absolutely,
just for the sake of modern people who may be Googling the Grobin Colony.
Thank you.
Don't look for Estonia.
I get corrected on that all the time. I think in the future, I'm just going to avoid saying the modern country and just say on the coast of the Baltic.
Yeah, exactly.
So this particular standing stone is one of many of the type. This is a little bit, this is from the early Iron Age, from the 5th and 6th century. There's many of these beautiful stones with this sunwheel depicted on it. And you look at this, and there's several wonderful examples in the Gotland Museum. You look at it, and to our eyes, it's immediately suggestive of a shield. That you really can understand how men being confronted with these fantastic stones with these beautiful sunwheels on them were inspired to paint their shields. So this axe-bladed shape is sort of the earliest of the standing stone. again, there's in mainland Sweden and Denmark and other places, there are carved stones and stones that were painted, but they're usually on living rock, where these are carefully dressed stones, really carefully carved, beautifully painted, and erected. They are not gravestones. They're more, the later stones appear to be memorials to people or to honor the gods. And these sunstones, these sunwheel stones, really could have to do with the climatic crisis that appeared to have happened, in the 5th century, where possibly there was just a lot of volcanic debris blocking out the sun and creating a lot of famine across Europe and Northern Europe. And so the sunwheel motif is very popular at that, but they're so elegant. I just had to show you one of them. Just the beautiful creatures and the delicacy of the painting is so lovely.
Are these actual in this museum, or are these reproductions?
These are all real. These are all real. There are over 400 picture stones that we have found. Some of them have been carted off to Stockholm, to the State Museum there, but most of them are here. There are more being found all the time. They were incorporated into churches because very often the power places in which these stones were erected were sites in which churches were then built. And there's even a few churches that have them integrated right into the walls. That there's a standing stone that's been used as a huge building stone right in the walls, or used as gravestones. Some of them have been found upside down, used underneath the floors as flooring, and so on and so forth. So there's at least 400 that have been discovered, and there's many more out there that we haven't found yet. So yeah.
And how old is this one?
This one is an Iron Age stone, so it's 5th century, 6th century, something like that, probably.
I'm really floored by how pristine it looks. I mean, it's so clean. It doesn't look it's broken, but it's not. Yeah, I imagine, for me, I would imagine something this age to be a little bit more weather worn almost, right? Like
they have been repainted, really well. Of course. I mean, they very few of them actually had real traces of paint. So they have been repainted with charcoal and with the red oxide, the ones that are painted in red. But because a lot of them were in fairly sheltered locations, I mean, sometimes they were just pulled inside the churches because they were significant, they were important. I mean, the early Christian ministers were building the churches where there were people that would accumulate anyway, and that places that were already considered to be powerful and sacred. So very often these stones were, you can go to these, there was a huge building program undertaken around 1225 to 1275, a period of immense wealth for Gotland, and 100 small, beautiful limestone country churches were built. And in many of these churches, when you go to visit them, and I have visited all but 3 of them at this point, when you go to visit them, you'll see a standing stone there in the church cemetery. I mean, you just see, okay, the priest came and said, all right, this is already a place that people know and they gather here, and it's a revered place. We're going to build a church here. And typically it would be like a stave church first, and then it would be replaced by a stone church.
Oh, here we go.
Okay, so here we are again in the Gotland's Fornsal with me inserted for scale. This is just to give our viewers an idea of how large these stones are. I am 175 centimeters, 5'9". So this stone is immense. I mean, a lot of the stones are 10 and 12 feet tall. They're just huge. So this is another sunwheel. It's, again, very, very elegant. You see the serpent or dragon around the top, and the serpentine characters, the twinned serpentine characters there. They're just stunning.
Is that a little like a ship behind you? Like right behind you?
That is a ship. Yeah. That is a ship. Yeah. That is a ship.
It's so interesting, like this one and even the previous one as well. I used to teach the ancient world a few years ago, and we would look at some like Mesolithic art. I mean, it's some of this stuff looks very reminiscent of, designs that you see cross-culturally in other places in other previous periods of time as well.
Yeah. Well, again, the Gotlanders were known for their sailing skills. Who knows?
Crossroads. Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so this particular stone, this is a famous stone, the Ardre stone. This stone is a reproduction because the original has been carted off to Stockholm, but this is a very skillfully made reproduction. And I selected this picture because it shows the Ardre church in the background. So it's very typical, small, Gotlandic, early 13th century limestone church. And this stone is fairly close to where the original was. So this is more typical of what we think of a pictorial stone because there's so much going on here. You immediately, your eye is taken both to the ship and to Sleipnir, Odin's, eight-legged horse up at the top, and with a Valkyrie greeting either Odin astride Sleipnir's back or a slain warrior. The ship is beautifully rendered. Again, the fact that the sails appear to be depicted as that there were narrow strips of linsey woolsey or a hemp and linen combination interleaved with each other for strength. You see the rigging really carefully and so on. So there's just so much going on here. No inscriptions. This is just stories, but a riot of wonderful pictures in a stone like this. And many of the stones look quite similar to this and have this sort of wonderful detail and a plethora of action in them. So this is the Ardre stone.
Right, and just to point out the ship there, correct me if I'm wrong, Terry, my understanding is before the Gokstad ship was unearthed, this was it. This is what we had, or historians had, to inform us on the ships, the long ships, right? Because they were written about in sources, and there were pictographs and chronicles and so forth that showed us certain things. But this was essentially what was considered the most faithful reproduction of the ships until we actually found one in the ground. Right. And also I want to point out just this, I think this is really for William and Rainer's benefit. Notice what they're wearing here on their belts. It's not axes, it's not saxes, it's not rocks, it's swords.
Sword.
So, to remind our audience, what was the best weapon that was when we had our episode with Rainer Oscarsson and William Short, the number one weapon for Vikings was the rock. But here they're definitely displaying their swords, quite conspicuously.
Saxons used a lot of rocks as well, as we know. All those young boys with their slings. Rocks were very effective to soften up the troops, so right. I won't cast aspersions on rocks, but you're absolutely right. These are elite warriors. They have belted swords.
Just on a complete aside on the rock thing too, I was listening to David and Goliath by Malcolm Gladwell, where he talks about how we've essentially misinterpreted the whole David and Goliath battle, because it turns out that the slingers at the time a slinger would have completely outmatched a foot soldier in full armor, right? Like he did a whole thing on it about how
many men were killed. Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, a 14-year-old boy. I mean, really, when you really look at the shield wall, the Saxon shield wall, and this is what, because they wrote about it, we even have depictions, embroideries of this. We understand. I mean, there were very young boys there with their slings, slinging rocks. The lighter, smaller men were throwing javelins, light throwing spears, and there were lots of archers. And that was softening up the enemy for the big, strong guys who are literally in the shield wall. So, rocks play a big part in this.
Yeah, I heard that. And I was like, aha.
Missiles are very effective.
Yeah, rocks. It's when all else fails, pick up a rock.
Sometimes it's the only thing at hand. This is an outdoor museum, quite a lovely one. just up north, sort of in the middle of the island, but up north, called the Bunye Open Air Museum. And this is an original stone. Again, it has been repainted. You can see it was broken and pieced back together. Again, I'm inserted for scale so you can see how huge it is. This particular ship is just magnificent. I love the roiling waves underneath it. You can see the curling, cresting waves underneath it, the elaborate rigging. And then there's some very interesting stories going on. The panel, this is this mushroom shape, or the phallic shape is the later shape that these stones took. And you see just with the head is that there is another small ship, and there's a female figure standing between it and a number of men. Thank you. And this possibly could be the story of Hild, the abducted princess, who is trying to mediate between her fathers and brothers who are coming to kill her abductors and the husband that she now doesn't want to be killed. I mean, she's really enacting the role of a peace weaver here. So this is thought that possibly this is the story of Hild, where this woman is between them and meeting this armed force and trying to mediate. And then above that, we have a scene of human sacrifice. There is, to the far left, just where the stone flares out, you see a sort of a member that is like a tree trunk bent down, and that there is a man, exactly, there is a man being hung there. So it is a warrior in full kit. And then there's right next to him, there is a man who is lying down on an altar sort of thing and about to be executed as well. So this is a scene of human sacrifice.
So do we know art historically, like, again, as I'm looking at this, I'm thinking back to like some of these other things that I used to teach about in these, and again, the ancient world, I mean, going back into, Sumeria, Egypt and all of that. And the idea of what they call like these standards or friezes, where you've got, you can see that there's different scenes going on here, right? And they're being played out in these, horizontal spaces that have ground to each of them. So it's like this thing that we call continuous narratives. Like, is this all part of or believed to be all part of kind of one story, or do we have multiple things going on here?
There are definitely repetitive themes. I mean, the story of Wayland the Smith is oftentimes depicted, and his being hamstrung and his revenge, the exploits of Odin. I think Hild appears in more than one. There's several wonderful stones in the museum which show women driving wagons, apparently into the underworld, and being greeted by women with drinking horns. And those are particularly interesting because of the roles of women there. So there's and again, there's many stories that have been lost to us. I mean, that nobody really can interpret. There's characters and things that just don't seem to make sense based on what we think the sagas were about, because so much has been lost. But
there's no runes or anything. There's no inscription of any kind.
There on these earlier stones, no. I mean, later on, when the stones are much more dedicated to men and women and erected at a ford, for instance, or a memorial stone for somebody who went away and never came back, then there will be a runic inscription. But on these, no.
I think it's so interesting. I mean, we used to do this kind of experiment with my students where we'd look at, some of these ancient objects like this that don't have any written text involved, and then say, okay, we read these types of artifacts, or we can, in a similar way to reading a text. It's just different, right? But like, if you're an alien and you just landed, and then you see this thing, it's like, okay, tell me, what is it you think you know about who these people were, right? And so it's like, okay, well, these people clearly liked sailing in boats. They clearly seem to have tamed horses. They like weapons or pointy things. You know what I mean? It's just sort of this really interesting experiment in trying to just sort of suss out what it all is, and also even with the cosmology too, because you don't have a roadmap for saying, well, this is actually a deity of some kind, not an actual human being. So you're kind of mixing these things all together, but it's just sort of really fun to try to figure these people out just by this, right?
Right. And Terry, there's such a correlation between, again, these 100 beautiful country churches that were, built just a couple of 100 years after this, because many of them still remain with richly painted interiors, which are these narrative strips of the life of Christ. And I was at a church last week, which has an amazing story of the martyrdom of Saint Margaret of Antioch. Really, really detailed, quite gruesome, but from like 1280, and it was just there. And again, when in a pre-literate age, how exciting it was for people to be able to see these things and piece together the story themselves, or have someone who knew more tell them the story. But it certainly it's so vivid. It sets the story in one's mind when you see it pictorially, powerfully depicted.
Yes, exactly. Especially at this scale.
Yes, especially, it's daunting. I mean, they are so huge, and there's still some remaining in fields and so forth that you can go and see. I think there's a 15 or 20 that have been identified in fields, and you can go to see them. Some of them you can still, if you stand with oblique light, like the sun is hitting, you can still see the design carved on it. But it's awe-inspiring to come up to them and find them there, and most of them are just enormous like this. And of course, when you think about how big they are, you also have to think how much of it is buried.
Yeah.
There's a tremendous amount of this buried to stay upright,
Yeah. Or also just think about how long it would have taken them to execute the whole thing.
Exactly. Right. I mean, these were very expensive monuments.
So I do want to point out, I'm looking at this, and I haven't stared at one of these with this much detail in a long time. But just noticing that most of these, it's pictures or drawings of people, animals, and then conspicuously in the middle, there's just a symbol, just one. Right? It's a Vulknut. It's just sitting there, but there's just one symbol. It's right on top of the sacrifice. Do we know anything about why?
Yeah. Whenever you see a sacrifice, you will see a Vulknut, just about always.
Really? Okay. I didn't know that. That's my understanding, Terry, was that Vulknuts are not particularly Viking-ish, but I guess, but here's one on a stone. So
I can send you several photographs of Gotland stones with Vulknuts. Yes.
Really
I think the issue with in the kind of the modern interpretation by some groups of what the Vulknut means is that we don't actually know what it so people have kind of co-opted it for whatever they want.
Yeah, I think I remember reading something about it was associated with Odin or something, and there's a raven right there, so that would make sense. But yeah,
or those who have fallen in battle, sometimes people use it for that. So yeah.
Right.
But
I do find it interesting that there's a human sacrifice, there's a Vulknut, and Octavia, you just mentioned that that's pretty common. So there's some kind of attachment to death, right?
It was inevitable if you were a warrior, so you'd better picture it in a glorious style.
Yeah. That's interesting. Anyway, I just want to point that out. I was like, oh, look what's there. And I mean, this is an area that I have very no knowledge about, so I'm just asking questions. Next one. Woo.
Yeah, this is just a very, very small portion of the Spillings horde. It was very badly eroded. Again, this is 67 kilos, 148 pounds of silver buried in the earth. The earliest coin that was buried with all of these bangles and bracelets, the earliest coin was a 6th century Sasanian coin. And the latest coin was minted in 881. So that really dates its burial beautifully. It was, a lot of the silver was quite eroded because for some reason it had been packed in bags of salt. So it took a tremendous amount of cleanup to get it to look this good. And when you, at the Gotland's Museum, you can see some that's beautiful like this, and others which is just silver oxide and just a, a degraded mess. Interestingly enough, the bronze treasure, the 20 kilos of bronze treasure, which again contains some very, very beautiful pieces of work from the Slavic lands, strap hinges and shapes and so on and so forth, that was beautifully packaged in a stout wooden chest with lovely strap hinges and a lock and everything. It was treated with much greater respect, if you will, than the silver, which was jammed into salt bags. But it to go into the treasure hall of the Gotland Museum and be confronted with so much silver and a fair amount of gold as well. There's definitely been finds of gold here on the island, but to be confronted with it and to see a small portion of the 200,000 coins that have been found here, it is really a stellar experience. And I really do want to encourage students of the era to visit Gotland, because it is such a beautiful island. It's so concentrated in its richness, and just by spending an afternoon in the Gotland Museum, your eyes will be opened. You'll go away with so much, and so much inspiration, so much admiration for these people.
So how does the government there feel about metal detectoring?
It is not permitted.
Okay, because I was going to say, this to me would seem like Gotland would be like, San Francisco in 1848, like some kind of gold.
Terry, you will appreciate this. You will appreciate this. I live right in Visby, which is a very beautiful medieval town. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. One cannot dig in their garden deeper than 30 centimeters without an observer.
Wow.
So it's almost like planting a rose. You need to be careful not to come across any treasure. So that's what it's like. There's so much under the ground. So, I mean, obviously when this farmer discovered part of the hoard, of course, the museum came back with, detection materials, and they found the rest of it. But yes, it's too much upon the ground. And as I said, there's in the Gotland Museum, there's a wonderful longhouse again on the East Coast called Stavgard, Viking era longhouse, and school children on a school outing found a rabbit, literally kicking silver out of its burrow. I mean, getting rid of this rubbish. It's everywhere. That was in 1975, and there's more. Finds are discovered all the time. There's so much here, and it makes it exciting. I mean, when you're in the countryside, I mean, you never know what you're walking on.
Yeah, I think it's interesting too, maybe to point out for our audience. I mean, some of who will know this, who are familiar with the Viking Age, but when you kind of look at just this mass of material like this and think, wow, okay, these must have been really rich people, or you're just like, why do they have so much of this stuff? And then when you add on to it, I mean, not only like the arm rings or neck rings or whatever we're looking at, but also the silver dirhams you're talking about, which are, actual coins. But that even with the coins, for these people, it was about the weight of all of this stuff. So yes. It's literally about the mass of it, not the actual like value of a coin. Like this one is 25 cents or whatever. And so the wealth of it is just in how much of it you can get a hold
and
of.
All of this jewelry is pretty much made to weight, so that which was very typical, that the jewelry was made so that it was very easy to say, okay, this is half a mark, this is a full mark, and so on and so forth. And of course, there's so much hack jewelry out there, because you needed small bits to pay for small purchases. And of course, many coins were conveniently scored. They had crosses on them. So not the dirhams, of course, but many of the beautiful coins, of course, ended up as jewelry, as sort of bracteates. So the coins were admired just for their own beauty. And many of the dirhams are very lovely to look at. But yes, the jewelry here in the Spillings hoard, unlike the dirhams, which are from Arabia, the jewelry, much of this jewelry, if not all of it, is actually of Gotlandic make. And there's certain jewelry designs which are very distinct. I mean, I'm sure are aware of our beautiful crystal balls, which are in silver mounts. I mean, the crystal came from probably India, but the mounts are silver mounts, which are made here. And there's some beautiful example of this crystal jewelry in the museum as well. So there was a very skilled silversmiths working here, not just these simple designs here, but some very elaborate, beautiful pieces as well.
So you mentioned the one saga a little bit ago, and I mean you're a writer. So what are the written sources for Gotland that we have for, say, the Viking Age period in particular?
Well, there's the Gute Saga, which is very, very brief, was written down quite late in 1220, so it's contemporary with Snorri, and it does tell the story of the foundation myth of Shelver, the first person, and then it goes on in a not exactly coherent manner about making a treaty with the king of the sphere. We need to be reminded that Sweden, in those days, a large portion of the southern part of the peninsula of Sweden was actually Danish. So the king of the sphere, the king of the Swedes, was essentially he was sort of the king in Uppsala, as I refer to him in my books, the king in Uppsala. So he was the king of the sphere. He's not even named during this. There's an elaborate story about the old crafty Gotlander who goes to negotiate with the king of the sphere, who remains unnamed through it. It's short, but it does cover a number of things that tell us a little bit more. Unfortunately, because it is so late, 1220. Again, the difficulty when you do not have scribes writing things down. So
my understanding from basically what I've read with what I like to call the Eastern Vikings, forgive the nomenclature, but it's just a nice blanket term. The Svear and then the Gotis. So Gotland was originally settled by what we might consider Goths, right? And then the Svear were actually native to Sweden.
correct.
And so,
correct.
I don't know, help me out here. Where so how did the settlement of Sweden? What do we know?
Do you want to talk about Beowolf potentially being? I mean, have either of you been aware of that theory and ongoing scholarship that Beowulf was possibly a Gut and not a Geat? Because at Stavgard, where I just mentioned, which is the where the rabbit horde was kicked up, there is a very impressive longhouse remains that certain scholars at the University of Uppsala believe that actually could have been Beowulf's Hall, and that this enormous, absolutely the biggest mound that we have, which is not far away, burial mound, is his burial mound. And this is based on both linguistic evidence and topographic evidence, because talking about the whales passing and so on and so forth, because there were whales in the Baltic in Beowulf's time. So this is another very interesting pathway of discussion is, could Beowulf have been a Gut and not a Geat? So there's, so it is fascinating to think about. One of the things I will say is that the Beowulf story, because of course it was written in Old English and is one of the great foundational pieces of the English language, is not well known here, unfortunately. And that is something that I would certainly like to see corrected, because it is really the story of Sweden and Denmark and possibly Gotland. I mean, Gotland was independent for so many centuries, but I would like to see, I'm happy to see this interest in Beowulf, because I want people to know the story here. And so that, to me, it's worth it to learn more, to discuss it, and to look at it just for that, because it's not just a story belonging to England, it's a story belonging to the Norse as well.
Yeah, definitely. And for all you out there, don't watch the movie, read Seamus Heaney's translation. It's the best still.
I like Kenneth Raffles myself, but
Oh, okay.
it was the first one I read as a young girl, and I love that translation. But yeah, I like Hoyt. I don't like starting with so. It doesn't capture the excitement for me. It's my great respect for Seamus Heaney as a poet, but I like Simon Raffles. I really do.
So are
Right.
the things that we saw, these things that are the guests that you're inviting in August and September, this is stuff that they will see on their tour?
Yes. So I am hosting 2 7-day tours of Gotland. These are my readers. They're coming from around the world, including many great readers from Australia. I love my Australian readers. They are deeply, deeply interested in Gotland and the era. So I will be taking them. We'll obviously be going to the Gotland Museum, but I will be taking them out into the countryside and looking at the landscapes which inspired scenes in my books. They're going to go to the site where the hall of my main characters stood. I'll be taking them to the Shelver's Grave, which is a really beautiful ship setting stone. We'll be, looking at topography. We'll be looking at examples of late Middle Age Viking, late Middle Age homesteads, medieval farms and homesteads, which are very, very similar because Gotland changed glacially slowly when Linnaeus came here in 1741. He was astounded at how primitive Gotland was. I mean, he spent the summer here in 1741 and classifying insects and all the wildflowers and everything. But he said it was just like, I mean, he was of course a very well educated cosmopolitan, Stockholmer, and to come here, and he felt he'd gone back to 1200. So we have many things that are 400 or 500 years old, which really are very similar to what the 9th century looked like. So I'll be taking them to special, farms and landscapes like that.
I'm going to be in Denmark in August, and now I feel bad that I'm going to be so close and yet
so
far.
You need to join us. Yeah.
It'd be just a quick pond jump for you, Terry. Just head on over just one day. Yeah.
No, do come. Both of you do come. It's richly rewarding, a richly rewarding trip, and it's eye-opening and magnificent. And we have unparalleled treasures. We really do. I mean, the contributions that Gotland has made to Norse studies cannot be overstated. So please come.
Your mention of the cosmopolitan Stockholmer, it triggered so I grew up in France, and there's a funny story that is told there about René Descartes, because there's a famous story from when René Descartes was alive. And so there was a Swedish princess, and I don't recall her name, but she was heir to the throne, and she wanted to learn from the greatest minds in the world. And so she asked her court, she said, hey, what are the greatest, who can I learn from? Who's the greatest mind in the world? They said, well, it's obviously René Descartes from France. Oh, okay, well, call for him, and I'd like to learn from him. So she invited René Descartes to Sweden to learn from him, and he went over there, saying, oh, sure, I'll go be your instructor for a while. And she made him follow her rigorous routine, which was get up at dawn, go horse riding, go bow hunting, da 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 da. And after about 2 weeks of this, René Descartes was
exhausted.
so exhausted that he was like, I have to go home. And he took a ship home, and when he arrived in Paris, he actually died.
Our apologies. Yes. No, this is like our Crown Princess Victoria. She, served in the military. She's a wonderful equestrian. Right. It's the outdoor life is the way to go here. So
this was René Descartes, who was, I would consider him to be the cosmopolitan.
Yes. Right. Right. Well, Linnaeus fortunately was of hardy stock. He had to be, because he was a naturalist and he was always out hiking. But he was, again, he felt he'd been transported back hundreds of years. So, and that's part of the charm of the island. It's really, really easy. We have every August, we have an incredible first week of August, an incredible Medeltidsveckan, the medieval week, which actually commemorates the huge battle in 1361, where Valdemar Atterdag, a Danish king, came and slaughtered 2,000 Gotlandic soldiers with his trained mercenaries and took over the city, and then left 2 days later and never returned. But a battle is reenacted outside the walls, every year, with a very large version of it, with reenactors coming from around the world every 4 years. And one of them was 2019, when I made pretty extensive film of that. There's nothing like doing that in the actual location where it happened. Right. I mean, reenactors want to come and do this because it's, you're on the ground, you're where these battles were fought. It is quite wonderful, and the town wall is in an amazing state of preservation. 27 of the 29 original towers are still there, and the town is so charming and so beautiful. So there's much to lure you here,
including yourself.
Thank you.
Yeah. So in the show notes, we'll put a link to your website so people can go and
thank you.
If they're not familiar, then they can take a look at what you're doing there. I, for one, as a person who makes this all the time and am about to eat it after this show, was happy to see a recipe for skyr.
Oh, great.
They sell it at Safeway now.
Yeah, they sell it.
Yes,
yeah,
it's become
Icelandic skyr. Yeah.
I was just going to say, I think it's because the popularity of trips to Iceland is that now, so many people have been to Iceland, which is so wonderful as well. But you see it, either that or quark, on the breakfast table all the time. And so people have brought it back to the States. So
yep, and it's very easy to make.
Good for you.
It's the great irony of history, right? Vikings were the vacationing Scandinavians that went everywhere, and because of that, they're now building a tourism industry off of it to get people to come to them.
That's brilliant. That's genius.
As long as we don't turn into Dubrovnik, I never want that to happen to Visby. So it's very important that Visby remains Visby, right, and doesn't become the setting for that kind of tourism. So
yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
All right,
great. Well, wonderful. It's been wonderful having you on the show. This has been very illuminating for me, because Gotland's a little bit of a blind spot for me. I've read about it, but this was a nice
I expect you
look.
here, CJ. I expect you here. So let me know when you're coming. I'll meet you at the dock. So
absolutely.
Awesome.
You want to come on the ferry because you want to approach it the way they did, so yeah.
Oh, right. Yeah.
If you fly from Stockholm, it's 30 minutes, so which is what I do. But if you want to come on the ferry, that's the way to approach any island. So, but thank you both. It's really been a very enjoyable hour. Thank you very much for having me on.
Absolutely. This has been great. Loved it.